California oil exec, was forced by doctors to take a 6-month sabbatical. I told you this is a detour, so follow me here. During that break, he went to a Bible conference. It was actually at Moody in Chicago. He'd been feeling this pressure and felt like scholarship had been taken captive by something other than traditional Christian beliefs. It seemed like some sinister force, and he went looking for answers. At this Bible conference, he had an idea, and I quote from him. He had this idea of sending some kind of warning and testimony to English-speaking ministers, theological teachers and students, English-speaking missionaries of the world, which would put them on their guard and bring them into right lines again. This man's name was Lyman Stewart, and he and his brother Milton proceeded to anonymously fund a guerrilla publishing effort to bypass more liberal universities and put traditional Christian teaching directly into the hands of pastors and church leaders. This guerrilla publishing effort is called the Fundamentals. It's 90 essays published between 1910 and 1915 by well-known scholars like R.A. Torrey and B.B. Warfield. Apparently, to be a well-known scholar in those days, you had to go by 2 initials. And these scholars defend against evolution, rejection of traditional doctrines, and the sort of developments in biblical studies that we've been talking about so far. But here's the genius of their plan. They were funded with California oil money, so they didn't need traditional publishing, and they didn't need to sell these essays. They mailed them directly to churches, pastors, and sympathetic professors for free. And we're not talking about a few copies, not a limited run, millions of copies. By the time the project wraps up, around 3 million copies have been distributed to pastors, missionaries, church workers across the country. And it turned out a lot of people were feeling the same way as Lyman Stewart and his brother. These essays galvanized a movement, what would be called the fundamentalist movement. So now you've got this interesting dynamic. On the one side, you have scholars continuing to ask questions about how the Bible developed, how texts were shaped, edited, passed down. On the other side, you have this massive effort making its way through churches, reinforcing a different instinct. Let's hold on to the core. Let's be cautious about new approaches. Let's make sure people have resources to respond to these things that are coming out of the academy. Part of the reason I wanted to take this detour and tell this story was because this, in a lot of ways, is the origin story of the Bible for normal people. Without this fundamentalist modernist rupture over the 1910s and 20s, there isn't much of a need for what we do, or at least there's much less of a need. The split between biblical scholarship as a mainstream discipline and pastoral ministry was amplified in this cultural moment. Of course, it led to the American evangelical movement, but even mainline church pastors often felt stuck, not always sure what to do with the insights that were coming out of the academy. So by the early 1900s, over a century ago, all the stuff we've been talking about is out
Split
there.
2. Split pace, 30 minutes, 43 seconds per mile.
It reflects historical development. It contains different voices. It's shaped by these real-life situations. At the same time, you've got evolutionary science gaining traction. You've got theology itself shifting toward ethics and away from supernatural claims. For a lot of Christians, that just felt like too much change. So these fundamentals came at just the right time for where a lot of more conservative Christians were. Defend the core beliefs of Christianity. But importantly, it's not just what they defended, it's the posture that they were taking. So instead of asking, how do we explore these new scholarly insights? The tone becomes more about, how do we defend the Bible against people in the academy out to destroy our faith? Let's connect this directly to what we've talked about so far. Scholars are asking, how was the text composed? When and why did it develop? What are the social settings that produce these traditions? But in this time, in response, a different set of questions begin to dominate. How do we defend the unity of the Bible? How do we explain away the contradictions? How do we preserve its authority? That was a critical question. It's a different starting point. So we have these essays coming out in 1910 to 1915. And then 10 years later, in 1925, we have the famous Scopes monkey trial, where a man named John Scopes was accused of violating the Tennessee Butler Act, it's a real thing, which made it illegal to teach evolution in public school. This trial takes the growing divide between this modern Christianity and traditional Christianity mainstream. It put the debate onto the national stage and asked people to take a side. All the momentum that had been building from this fundamentalist coalition over the past 10 years was getting a public spotlight. While Scopes was technically found guilty of teaching evolution, the court of public opinion fell hard towards Scope's attorney, Clarence Darrow. National media outlets portrayed the conservative position as anti-intellectual and ignorant. And that's important because this marked a turning point. Instead of trying to engage and change the mainstream universities and challenge the scholarship we've been talking about, this coalition began to withdraw, and instead they just created their own parallel private universities. After this period, many conservative Protestants kind of take their ball and go home. They don't double down and try to engage the academic scholarship, trying to take those institutions back over. Instead, they start building independent Bible colleges and seminaries. They start openly preaching a distrust of universities and these critical methods. They create a parallel intellectual world. And because of that, this gap between academic biblical scholarship and fundamentalist biblical scholarship really starts to widen, so that by the mid-20th century, you've got really two conversations happening at the same time. In the academy, the scholars are continuing to ask those same questions. How did the text develop? What are the historical pressures that shape them? What are the oral traditions that lie behind them? But in a lot of churches, the focus becomes defending biblical authority, harmonizing difficult passages, maintaining doctrinal certainty. Of course, these aren't just different answers, they're different questions entirely. And that's why we talk a lot here about questions. What questions we're asking matter, not just the answers. Out of this gap, a whole new industry springs up. We call it the apologetics industry, which is publishing materials and lectures that defend those fundamentals against the claims that are coming out of biblical scholarship, out of science, or anything that challenges the idea that the Bible is historically, scientifically, and ethically perfect. The apologetics industry becomes organized, more systematic, more central to the faith of a Christian. Part of what it meant for me to be a Christian as a kid was to guard myself against the mainstream experts in science and biblical studies. And the tools I had to guard myself were produced by this apologetics industry. This matters. And it's why I included it here in this podcast as the fifth aha of biblical scholarship, because it's at this point that biblical scholarship continues to evolve, but large segments of the religious public and large segments of pastors and church leaders are starting to engage the Bible with a different set of tools. Where biblical studies goes from here is largely ignored by evangelicals. And when they do respond, it's not with context and history of the field of biblical studies, but from a very defensive posture. So when someone hears there are multiple sources in the Pentateuch, they're not just hearing a historical claim, they're hearing a challenge, something that's already been framed as needing defense. Right? Before this moment, the dominant question in scholarship was, how do we understand this text more deeply? After this moment, in a lot of contexts, the dominant question becomes, how do we protect what we believe about this text?